I was born November 28, 1944. My family came to live along Bayou Lafourche because my grandfather, Barbera, immigrated from Italy, from Sicily in 1906, and he settled in Napoleonville, which is where I grew up, went to high school. But my family, the Barberas in Louisiana all came from that one immigration of my grandfather, Girolamo Barbera. Actually, his name was spelled I-E-R-A, and he dropped the I when he came. He was a shoemaker and then started selling automobiles in the early 1920s. He was in the automobile business. He took over the dealership from my grandfather. My dad was in LSU, graduated in 1940, was on active duty when the war broke out. So it was 1945 before he got back to Napoleonville. My grandfather had been in the automobile business at that point for over 20 years. And my dad, because of my grandfather's state of health, took over the dealership and stayed in the automobile business until he retired in the 90s. I'm married to Judy Claus. Judy and I were high school sweethearts, and we graduated from Assumption High School together. We've been married, it will be 50 years this coming January. We have 3 sons, 3 children, 3 boys. I went to LSU undergraduate school, graduated in 1966, and then went from there into LSU Law School and graduated in 1969. I chose LSU because my dad was an LSU graduate. We were big football fans. I started going to LSU football games when I was probably 8 or 9 years old. It was kind of a given. That's where I was going. I was going to LSU. Judy and I were married in my senior year of undergraduate school in 1966. So shortly after we were married, I graduated with my undergraduate degree and we stayed in Baton Rouge. I got a job with the legislature that summer and then started law school in the fall of 1966. I decided to be a lawyer probably in high school because my father talked to me about it, told me about how he really wanted to go to law school. That was his intention. He went on active duty in 1940, assuming that he would come out of the Army in 1942, and then his plan was to go to law school. Well, that plan was interrupted by 2 things: World War II, which caused him to stay on active duty for 3 more years, and then my grandfather's state of health, which made it imperative that he go to work immediately when he came off of active duty to take care of the family. And my dad talked to me about it, got me interested in it, and by the time I graduated from high school, I had already made a decision to go to law school. The plan after undergraduate school, of course, was to go to law school. But then I had a military commitment. I was commissioned as a 2nd lieutenant after undergraduate school. So in order to go to law school, I had to get a deferment so that I could go to law school first and then go on active duty. I gave thought to doing it the opposite way, but I decided to go to law school first. So I got a deferment, and then I also changed my branch. I was in the military police corps, and then after law school I was in the legal branch of the Army called the Judge Advocate General's Corps. Of course, that increased my commitment from 2 years to 4 years, but I wanted to work as a lawyer on active duty, and that's what happened. I graduated in 1969. I had to wait until I passed the bar exam before I could go on active duty, so that was a long summer. I remember trying to get some part-time work, which I was able to do, and then took the bar exam, passed it, and then went on active duty in September of 1969 and spent 4 years on active duty at Fort Knox, Kentucky. And I was just fortunate. The way it worked with Army lawyers, there was a great shortage of lawyers in the Army because the Army was increasing the numbers because of Vietnam. We had a huge number of people in Vietnam. There was a great need for lawyers, and even people who were not in the legal branch were doing legal work. So I did not go to Korea or Vietnam. I was just fortunate. About half of the people in my law school class from the Army Law School would go either to Vietnam or Korea, and I was just fortunate. I just slipped through the cracks, stayed at Fort Knox for actually 3 years, 10 months, and 29 days. All right, well, my plan in 1973 when I was going to be discharged was to find a job. So I started sending out letters to law firms all over South Louisiana, New Orleans, Baton Rouge, Shreveport, not Shreveport, but Lafayette, Franklin, Jeanerette, and I had one response, one positive response that happened to be from my hometown, from Napoleonville, was Risley Treesh and Robert Sternfels. Treesh and Sternfels right in Napoleonville. So that's where I went to work. I stayed there for about 1.5 years. I was living in Thibodaux, driving back and forth to Napoleonville, because by that point my family, when I got out of the Army in '73, my family had already moved from Napoleonville to Thibodaux because my father acquired another dealership in Thibodaux in the interim period. And so I wanted to live in Thibodaux where the rest of my family was. So I drove back and forth and then opened an office in Thibodaux in 1975, a solo practice, and started practicing law in 1975 on my own in Thibodaux. In 1976, after I'd been in practice for a little over 1 year, I heard that there was an opening in the district attorney's office for an assistant. So I applied, and I wasn't very hopeful about that because I wasn't a Lafourche person. I was an Assumption Parish boy. I came to Thibodaux, and although I knew the district attorney, I knew the first assistant, because he and I, although we didn't go to the same high school, we were the same age, and we knew each other. So I was really very surprised that I was offered the position, which I was excited about because I was able to keep my practice and also earn some extra money through the district attorney's office. I was able to attend matters in the federal court, which I found very, very interesting, very exciting. I was able to see attorneys from the big city in action. I was on the other side of a big city lawyer in one case that I was handling for the police jury. She was the very first female lawyer in New Orleans to be a partner in a law firm in New Orleans, Mary and Meyer Burkett. And we're sitting here today in 2015. I think Ms. Burkett is still going to her office. I think she's in her mid to late 90s. But she was very well known and very well respected, and she was my opponent in this one particular case. And the judge, the federal judge, yelled at every lawyer in the courtroom about what to do and what not to do. And when she walked in, he stopped and looked at her and said, "Good morning, Miss Burkett." So I knew at that point that I had little chance of success, and I was right. I lost miserably that day to Miss Burkett. What made me want to be a judge? Looking back at that time in 1986, which is when the issue came up, because Judge Knobloch, Bernard Knobloch, talked of retirement. Judge Wolin Falgout talked of retirement in the latter part of 1986. I had been in practice barely 11 years, 12 years at that point, although I spent 4 years in the Army, so between 69 and 86 was not yet 20 years, which, you know, that was kind of unusual in that time. Usually judges were lawyers that had been in practice for a long time, maybe in their 50s or 60s, before they would run for judge. So I gave a lot of thought to that, and I talked about it with my wife and with my family and several friends and associates of mine, and looked around to see who the potential candidates might be, and decided that it was the right thing for me to do. I was tired of being torn between my practice and my work in the district attorney's office. In fact, at that point, my practice was literally drying up because I was spending so many hours a day doing district attorney work. So I announced in early 1987 that I was going to be a candidate. Judge Knobloch made the decision at the end of 1986 that he would retire at the end of 1987, and he made that known, and I announced my candidacy. Judge Falgout decided not to retire, so there was one other attorney who happened to also be an assistant DA, J.J. Ernie, and he decided that he was going to run, so he and I were candidates in the election in 1987. I became the chief judge in 1995. The chief judge in Louisiana, contrary to public belief, is not the senior judge, but is actually elected by the other judges. And generally, the senior judge in time of service ends up being the chief judge, but that's not always the case. And I found myself, after only 7 years on the bench at that point, being the chief judge. Louisiana District Judges Association, and that was in the mid-90s, mid to late 90s. One of my high school classmates, Ronnie Cox, who had become a judge, and he got active in the association, and when he was the president, he asked me to serve on the executive committee, which was a group of judges that form a committee with the president and the other officers to decide issues and interface with the Supreme Court. And I stayed on that committee for several years, and then I was asked if I would accept a nomination to be the treasurer. Well, like in many other organizations, once you become the treasurer, then you become the vice president, and although you technically are elected by the members of the body, if there's a recommendation to all of the district judges that this person be the treasurer or the secretary or whatever, they end up generally being elected. So I stayed on that committee, became the treasurer, worked my way up through the ranks, and then was elected and took office as the president of the association in October of 2004, and served for a year until 2005. Actually, I was the president when Katrina happened, which turned everything upside down in Louisiana. I can remember that time. Judges were displaced. Judges were missing from some parishes. Nobody knew Supreme Court was looking for them. I can remember helping the judicial administrator, trying to locate judges, trying to find facilities where judges from other parishes near the Gulf Coast could conduct court because their courthouses were underwater. So it was a very interesting time. Well, the decision to retire, actually I wanted to retire, thought about retiring at the end of my term, the term that ended in 2008, but decided that I needed to serve a little bit longer, that I was still in good health, and thought that I could still do the job and do it well, so I decided to stay. When my term ended in 2014, I had planned to retire, but really didn't have a choice. Even if I had wanted to stay, under the Louisiana Constitution, judges cannot take office after they have reached the age of 70. So I reached the age of 70 just about 30 days before the end of my last term. So I would not have been able to take office, I think, even if I had been elected. Since I've retired, I still am doing some work. I don't intend to practice law, but I have told the Supreme Court that I will sit on cases where judges in other parishes have recused themselves, stepped aside from cases, and I have had several assignments from the Supreme Court in several parishes in Louisiana to do that, and I've enjoyed it very much. It's a pleasure to go places that I have not been, to sit in courtrooms, in courthouses where I had not been before. I've met some very interesting people and have really enjoyed doing that and hope to continue. as a lawyer and a judge, particularly as a judge, I'm looking back on my time as a judge. I think I'm very proud of the fact that I was able to bring the court in Lafourche Parish to a point where we developed two things. Courthouse security. We were one of the first courthouses in the state of Louisiana to have a security point where everyone who came into the courthouse had to be examined and checked and scanned for weapons and contraband. And also I'm very proud of the fact that we have for our employees in Lafourche Parish now a personnel policy that guaranteed them sick leave and annual leave in a way that would benefit them at retirement. I was able to, with the help of the people at the Supreme Court, to put that together. Those two things I look back on, plus the fact that I think I did my job. I worked hard as a judge in Lafourche Parish, and I think I answered the call. The people elected me to perform as a judge, to do a job as a judge, and I think I answered the call.